This is the May 22nd Planning Commission work session. Staff present, Liz Olson, Carrie T, Chris Hocker, Addison Lewis.
Ryan Day.
Bonnie Padilla.
David Alkire.
Beth Richmond.
Jeff Miller.
All right. This evening, again, we have Jeff Miller, Beth Richmond from HKGI to give us an update on the progress of the zoning code audit, which, as we talked about last time, is really meant to be an assessment of our zoning code to look at whether it's still working the way we're intending and aligned with city goals. We've amended the code kind of piece by piece over time, but haven't really done a comprehensive update and look at the code since the 1970s. So that's really the purpose of this. Tonight is the second of 2 Planning Commission work sessions that we're doing, and then we'll have a third joint meeting once the report is finalized to present those findings to Planning Commission and Council. Tonight we're going to continue the discussion on the zoning districts and looking at the alignment of our districts with our comprehensive plan and small area plans. Also talking a bit about R1 lot standards, and then also a discussion on development procedures for applications like site plan review, PUDs, and minor subdivisions. So, take it away.
All right, we'll jump right in. So there's kind of 2, as Addison said, 2 big topics. We're going to talk about zoning districts some more, but really focus on how they align or how they compare to the comprehensive plans, land use categories. Touch on the small area plans and what they contain and how they affect zoning, and then existing lot sizes. Talk about the impact of those or the potential with those in the R1 district. And then we'll go into development procedures after that. Zoning districts, the language of this can get confusing, but the way we've been looking at it, and I think it maybe changed from the last meeting even, so 4 base districts. So those are districts that are intended to be used citywide, I would say. And then there's 5 plan districts, which consist of 17 sub-districts that act like districts, it seems like. So, and those are all the PRDs, the senior housing, the PSR, the mixed use, commercial, office, and industrial planned districts. And then there's 23 planned unit development districts, which is used more common now, or more frequently now than those planned districts, it seems like. And then there's 2 overlay districts. So there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of complexity in the code as far as which district's going to get used when the development comes in. So to go back to the comprehensive plan and what the guidance is from the comprehensive plan. So in the plan, there's descriptions of all the land uses, or the land uses for each category, I should say. Densities are in there for the residential and the mixed use categories, both the minimum and the maximum. That's not always typical. Sometimes they just have maximums, I think. Well, in Met Council, you probably mostly have minimums too. There's a standard, I guess, in the comp plan for the percent mix of mixed use categories, residential versus commercial. FARs in there for the business categories. And then jobs, jobs per acre is identified in there for business and mixed use categories. So there's 14 land use categories. There's 4 residential, 6 mixed use, a couple business and a couple public. The 4 residential categories are low density attached, medium density, and high density. So we're going to compare these, especially the densities. So these are the densities that we talked about at our last meeting for each of the districts. So, as low as the maximum for R1 is 4.8, close to the 5, which does line up with the comp plan pretty well. And then they mostly go up, but these are based on the minimum lot area. So we've calculated these. If you go to the zoning code, you don't see these numbers. But to compare with or align with the comprehensive plan, we need to calculate what is the density that's allowed. And that's not always easy because some of these districts or sub-districts have allowances. So then those densities go up. So you can see PRD 3 goes up from 10 to 15 and PRD 4 doubles, gets up to 31. So those are the densities in the districts. And then if you try to line up the districts with the land use categories, just for residential, what we're showing here is, it looks like the district that aligns with low density residential, I think the only one is R1, and that aligns, you know, if the district is within the maximum of the land use category, 4.8 is less than 5. For the next one, there's 3 districts that have maximums that fall within the 4 to 8. And then the medium, the land use category just has a maximum of 12. So it's the same, there's no new districts that work for the medium land use category. So that's an issue, and we'll go through the findings. Because it's basically saying there's not any true medium density zoning districts based on density. Of course, medium density can be defined in different ways, but in the way that we've worked with these, that's what we would say. And then high density, there's 5 districts we've listed here, and you can see all the densities that fall within that land use. So that looks good. 3 out of the 5 are only allow senior housing, so it's really only 2 districts. So we'll get to that detail. And then we have the maps, if we need to pull them up. Did we send those out the last time? Some of those, right? You know, so you can see all the residential districts and sub-districts on the left-hand side. We also can, for this meeting, we mapped which districts, if you just map the districts that align with the low density attached residential, what does that look like? And so you can see where it's not medium density even, but where those areas are. And actually medium density, the only difference is PRD1 doesn't work for medium density, and there's only one PRD1 on the map, I think it's just that one. So that's also the map of currently zoned medium density districts in the city. I think that's what we're seeing. And then high density, we also mapped, there's really only 2 sub-districts, PRD 3 and 4, that allow densities that meet the comp plan's high density definition. So these are the properties that are zoned for high density based on those 2 districts. And then the senior housing map, we're just mapping which districts allow senior housing. You can see that there because there's 2 districts. There's actually 3, but one's never been applied. So feel free to ask questions or comment anytime while we're talking, but I'll just start to go into the findings. So there's only 2 residential-based districts, so we'd say typically there'd be at least a low density, a medium density, and a high density. In this case, the code has 2, and they're both low density, R1 and R2, and there's not really a medium or a high density zoning district. Each sub-district for the residential PRDs, the PSRs, Carrie or Addison can correct me if we're wrong, but it's our understanding that they were generally established for specific developments and sites in the past, and they weren't intended to be used broadly or applied broadly going forward. Sometimes they can because they work, but that wasn't the intent that.
So that's kind of the definition of spot zoning, right?
Well, it's like a PUD that could be used more broadly, but it generally
That
doesn't
was what they
work.
used in place of PUD,
Yeah,
Yeah,
but that's essentially what it was, you're
yeah,
right? Created that district for that project.
so it could be reused, it's just that it often doesn't work to be reused.
because it was tailored to meet a development. In a site. Permitted uses in the districts are typically oriented to a specific use, so some of the examples are, you know, in R2, only 2-unit dwellings are allowed, not even single-family dwellings. So I think I might have mentioned that at the last meeting, but that's very atypical, I would say. As I mentioned just earlier, 3 of the 5 high-density sub-districts that are out there that could be used, they only allow senior housing, it looks like. So that's why we're at that map where we just have 2 sub-districts that can really handle high-density residential without doing a PUD. And as far as the residential districts, there's a PSR 3 in the code, but it's never been applied to the map, so you probably don't need that.
So there was one of the, I think it was PRD 1, was actually lower density than R1?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's
Oh, and the reason
townhouse
that's,
on Vernon?
the reason that's happening, I think this gets overlooked a lot. The R2 is two units, two-unit dwellings. And so the lot size is at 2.9, but it's per 2-unit dwelling, so it's really double. So if the density is 2.9, but you're getting 2 units for each of those, that's 2.9 times 2. So I think that works for this code. That's what we see elsewhere, but I think sometimes that gets overlooked because you just see that. And actually in the code, it doesn't even show the density, so it's just focused on that minimum lot size. So if you don't actually calculate it, you wouldn't realize
Notice
it.
that, okay.
Yeah, you wouldn't notice it, I guess, is probably what happens. But it's good to know that, right?
Yeah.
So there, as I said, there's no medium or high density residential based districts in the code today. Only those sub-districts that were created in the past. The limited number of base districts seems to be increasing the need for rezoning for proposed residential developments, and we've talked about it with staff, and it sounds like most new developments require a rezoning, which, you know, isn't necessarily bad or good, but it's definitely a bigger process for a development to get completed if they have to go through a rezoning and all that's required with that. A variety of housing types is not well defined across the districts and density levels, so each district just has a list of the uses that are identified, so they're not, you know, they don't match up across districts. And so you get different language for those. So what we've been typically doing is creating a table that says, these are the housing types that we allow in the city or we want in the city. And then across the districts use the same language. So whatever that's called, if it's called a fourplex, just say these districts allow fourplexes, these don't. And you make it really easy to understand where things are allowed and where they're not allowed. Let's see. Yeah, so I just said the last bullet in different words. So we'll keep going. So district densities are too low to achieve the comp plan densities. So go back to that quick. High density districts only allow 10 or 15 units per acre. Even with the allowances, you only get up to 15 or 31. And then medium density districts, those two that R2 and PRD2 only allow 6 units per acre. So if you go back to that table, you can see that medium density, which I would say 12 maximum for medium density, is on the low side. But today, the only districts that get you, that it would be allowed in that range would be basically 6 units per acre. So there's no district I mean, so you do need a PUD to do the development, because the district's not there to allow that density. And then the same with the high-density residential. You can see those densities for those 5 districts. The highest one, that's with allowances, gets up to 43, but that's senior housing. 31 is the highest for, non-senior housing residential. And the comp plan is saying a maximum of 60, so it's half of what the comp plan is saying.
Carrie, was the the Hankerson project, I remember 9 per acre?
9 per acre, yep.
So that's in, just as an example, that's in the medium density, but over the zone, even for R2. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, things aren't lined up.
Because with R2, you need 15,000 square feet per lot, and those were 9,000 square foot lots.
Let's see, so we could talk about, I think we should go through the mixed use and then maybe see what you'd like to comment on or talk about. So in the comprehensive plan, the mixed use land use categories, there's 6 of them. The districts, which we looked at last time, the densities for the zoning districts that are allowed are pretty narrow and low, I would say. 10 to 13 is the maximum for those sub-districts, but again, I guess these were created for specific developments and sites, and probably wasn't about getting to a certain density necessarily.
Yeah, the idea behind the mixed development districts was to have half residential, half office, retail. And so that was the way the original, like, take MDD 6, which is Centennial Lakes, that was supposed to be half-half. But the economy, they weren't building much housing. And so that's where a lot of the housing was replaced with the office that you see out there today. There was a formula, you could only build so much retail, then you had to have so many residential units in order to get the retail or the office.
Yeah. So you're saying Centennial Lakes meets that density? It wouldn't be that low, would it?
Well, if you take the entire district, yeah, that does seem low.
It seems low.
It was supposed to have a lot more residential units than
Yeah.
were built.
Oh, and then the PCD sub-districts, they don't have density standards at all. So when you compare them to the comp plan land use categories, let's see, you can see.
So, yeah, sorry, seems kind of quiet in here, so I wonder if maybe we need to explain, like, which neighborhood, where neighborhood nodes are, where mixed-use center, because mixed-use center is 50th in France, and is Grandview too? Okay, and those are the only 2? And the other small area plans are the neighborhood nodes,
Yep.
That's right.
and then the greater Southdale. So what's the community activity center?
That's
a lot.
Southdale. It's
Southdale.
in between France and York, and a little on the other side of York.
You should be able to see it on this map, right? On the left side.
Yeah, it's all the, that looks like more like zoning, but
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
it is
zoning.
zoning, sorry. Yep, sorry.
it's essentially this area.
Can't fool Carrie.
So we did the same exercise where, for the neighborhood node, minimum's 10 up to 60. These are the residential these are the residential mixed-use districts that could meet that. So you can see again, goes up to 60. The very highest is 43, which is going to be that senior housing one. So again, it's like the maximum zoning district's about half of what the comp plan is saying should be allowed.
So the first 2 columns are the comp plan, and the
Yeah.
second 2 columns are our actual zoning.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, yeah, land use categories is the comprehensive plan.
And the idea behind establishing all those with the comp plans were, in order to achieve those densities, you needed to meet the Southdale guidelines, and we were gonna negotiate the PUD, and that's where the PUD came in. Rather than giving developers by right, really everything was to be negotiation through PUD.
Well, and also the MDD 5 and 6, 5 has a minimum tract area of 5 acres, and MDD 6 is 40 acres. So, you know, the likelihood that you're gonna
Oh, there- yeah,
reuse those on any individual site, like a neighborhood node, it's just not gonna happen.
Which one is
That's,
that?
so that's under section 36-555, special requirements, minimum tract area.
Yeah, because it was MDD 6 is Centennial Lakes, MDD 5 is Edinburgh, MDD 4 is Grandview, and that's it.
So yeah, even at our neighborhood nodes, if someone, you know, wanted to do a mixed-use project, you couldn't request a rezoning to that unless you had 5 acres for MDD 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, still would only get you 12.1, right, for MDD 5, is what that says.
So,
MDD 5 is the 12.1 maximum, is that right?
MDD 5, yeah, yep, yep. So you can see mixed use center, all these are similar, the first three. So this is just showing which districts you could apply to the comprehensive plan land use categories. Then you get down to the last three, the Greater Southdale District, the Community Activity Center, Regional Medical. These have minimums that are higher than all of those district maximums. So that's a challenge, doesn't work. And then the PCD could be used for those land use categories because there is no density maximum.
Yeah, those minimum low ends, those were mandates of the Met Council. We had much lower in what we submitted, and they said, nope, you gotta ratchet that up.
Because they're calculated off of that, right?
Because you need to have your.
Let's see. So, yeah, so we do have a mixed use map here if we want to look at it. We could bring up the comprehensive plan map, I'm sure, if we want. And then also the business zoning map we have handy. So the findings for the mixed use districts, or some of them, there's going to be more, I would think, but so no residential or MDD districts meet the minimum density, which I pointed out before for those three land use categories. There's no parcel zone MDD3, so there's another sub-district that's never been used. Maximum densities of districts do not achieve the maximum densities in the comp plan. Yeah, PCD sub-districts, I think what you found, they offer more flexibility because they don't have a density. So I guess you could start proposing getting rid of density maximums for more districts to make it more flexible. But
Yeah, because in the areas where it's, you know, guided for maybe higher density residential, we can't really use PCD because it allows the commercial.
yeah,
It's not what we're intending.
right. So maybe we could take a break there and see if there's questions or comments about anything we're finding that we think we really should focus on, or if we're missing anything.
Well, I think it's a lot of information, and you understand it in a different way than we do, and it might take me a little time so it's coming at me very dry. I'm letting you know, and I'm kind of like, okay. I get that they're not matching up, and I get that we need to use our land more densely. I think maybe a little bit more finding in the findings would help me.
So how do other cities map comprehensive planning zones to zoning zones? I mean, is it like one for one, or what's a good way to do it? In other words?
Yeah, it
What should
would
we
be
be
more,
doing?
there's usually more zoning districts than comp plan land use categories in general. Sometimes they're almost one-to-one, but usually there's multiple zoning districts that could be used for a category in the comp plan. I mean, the challenge here is, development's changed over time, I guess, in Edina also, where the densities have been going up, and these plan districts, I mean, they're from the past. They're not gonna keep up with trends in development styles. So the fact that those were done specifically for sites and developments means the districts just aren't there. And we're working with another city that has it's different than this, but they really lean on the PUD also. And they actually have standards in their PUD that they're running up against. And so they actually issue variances to a PUD, which doesn't make any sense to me, but because you're supposed to be using the PUD to offer flexibility, but they're actually running into standards that they can't live up to. But part of it is they don't have any base districts that they've used recently. So a lot of their land's already zoned PUD. It's kind of the same thing, it's just a different way of doing it, but they just have these districts that they don't refer to, they don't use, so they have nothing really to look at except each time somebody comes in, they negotiate. And they actually end up using previous PUDs as precedents. And we've seen there's commonality across those PUDs, so you could just create a district rather than having, multiple PUDs that come in pretty similar. But because there's no district out there to use, you have to do it individually each time.
Yeah, and I think adding on to kind of your question is that particularly for districts that have residential focuses, you want to make sure that that entire density range is captured in your districts. So whether you have one land use category with two districts and one gets at like the lower end and one gets at the higher end, that works. Or if you've got a one-to-one where you have the ability to create developments that fit that entire density range. I think that's kind of the important piece, is that you don't want to see that you're not being able to capture, for example, your entire medium density because you're just stuck at that low end. You want to give as much flexibility as you can for people to be creative with the lots they have or with the different products that come through, to understand kind of, to let as much as you can kind of things just happen organically instead of getting in the way either on purpose or on accident, depending on how that goes. But
What are some comparable, like inner ring suburbs that have developed, because we've got like the east side and the west side. The east side was developed 100 years ago, the west side was developed, 60 years ago. Are there comparable inner ring suburbs that are dealing with this residential density issue? And
Yeah. Yeah, again, it's not exactly the same, but we're working with St. Louis Park. There's a couple things we're addressing there, I guess. Unlike Edina, they have a lot of alleys.
yeah,
Kind of like the east-west thing. They have areas that have alleys, they have areas that don't have alleys.
yeah.
So we're actually setting the standards to allow smaller lots
With alleys.
if you have a lot with an alley.
Okay.
Because then you don't need the driveway on the front.
Yeah.
So you can have a narrower alley. And so that's what's being proposed in their code, is to,
So they're going to
Yeah,
allow
into
smaller
account.
lots with those alleys.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. They currently have to simplify it, two low-density districts, an R1 and an R2, that only allow single families, say. They currently have two of those, they have two different minimum lot sizes.
Okay.
Tons of non-conforming lots to both of them. And so we're working with them just to lower the minimum lot size
Okay,
to reflect what's in place.
okay.
So I think that kind of relates to here where you're saying, I mean, you have the issue of one district
Yeah,
addressing a lot of different lot sizes.
yes.
So, yeah, it would seem at a minimum you would need more districts to accommodate different lot sizes. Unless, you know, some cities are kind of leaning towards just smaller lot sizes being allowed,
Yeah.
but it depends on how much variation I think there is within the city.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like we're really bifurcated, because when we're talking about the ADUs, the expectations of people in Morningside, for example, and the closeness to their neighbors versus the expectations of people in Rolling Hills where they don't see their neighbors. I mean, it's just like two different cities, and I think we react to our neighborhoods in different ways.
Yeah.
So I feel very distinctly different than.
Yeah.
Right, if you look at the lot size map that you guys generated, you know, I guess this is what, a mile wide between like Xerxes and France? That is about, because you've got 1 mile blocks to 1 mile west of 100, and then you have that down to just below 62. So this area is all a street grid, and this area is all the cul-de-sacs and everything. So to your point, you can actually see on the map, kind of, must have been the farms or whatever, whenever they developed it, but it's really clear that this is, and it does go slightly west of 100.
It's like the
It's very
railroad.
rectilinear.
Yeah, I think the railroad, the Dan Patch lines, what's it?
It's a little bit, it's like a block east of there, yeah.
Are you talking about this map?
No, the other one.
The other one you made.
Although I suppose that one would do it too, but the color makes it a bit easier in the other one. Yeah.
This one?
Yeah, so. So here's 100. So you've got these 1 mile grids, right? And then that goes to, here's 100, it goes to 1 mile west of 100. This is what railroad was saying. The rail line goes right here. And then just south of 62, see, they're all rectilinear streets and rectangular lots. And then once you go, there's exceptions, of course, for some areas, but generally that's what it is. And then once you go west of there, then it's the cul-de-sacs and the larger. Well, you also have this area next to Hopkins, which also follows that pattern. So the city is sort of like 3 different parts, really.
Yeah. And that's what the streetcar line went to. It was up in that area.
Yep, and through Morningside also,
Yeah.
down France.
So, can you say that again about your, about the different residential, zoning for the different areas? You had mentioned, St. Louis Park is doing, they have 2 different?
Today they have 2 different zoning districts. They have, say one's 9,000 square feet, maybe the same as yours, and one's more like 7,500, or
Okay,
they're 2 different minimum lot sizes.
okay. And they're thinking of, allowing to split the ones that have alleys. And we have just one R1. We have 2 different.
Yep, that's where that median calculation thing came in, when the west side was developing.
Which median thing, just so I make sure.
So minimum lot size is, well, when all the 50-foot wide lots were developed, 50-foot wide was the standard. I don't know what the minimum, don't recall. But anyway, they came up with the minimum lot size of 9,000 square feet, 75 feet wide. But if you live in a neighborhood with lots larger than that, minimum lot size is established by all the lots around that individual property within 500 feet. And it's the median lot area, width, and depth. So every lot on the west side has a different minimum lot size.
And then, so when on R1, all of our setbacks vary
By lot size.
based on lot width.
Yeah,
Yep.
lot width.
And we have a lot of oddly shaped lots.
Very complicated.
Correct.
It's a lot to enforce, and it's a lot for the average property owner to understand what the requirements are for their specific.
Well, we can't even answer their questions
Right.
when they call. You have to go pay a surveyor.
You have to hire a surveyor. to
Thousands of
figure out-
dollars
It's a
to
few
know.
$1,000 question.
Yeah.
Well, I tell my clients that it's a legal document and in your best interest to have. So spend the money, right? Because it's kind of inexpensive in the long run.
Yeah, it's just, if you knew you couldn't do an addition that you were thinking about doing, you wouldn't wanna go spend thousands of
Yes.
dollars, you know, you would just, move on.
Well, you can do that on the, what are some suggestions you might have for, or what are different ways you think, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
Well,
Okay, but before you skip to the solutions, I have
you mind if
go
I back
ahead.
up about
an hour. This is super interesting, because I think people who've been involved for a while would not be surprised that our comprehensive plan is a bit more aspirational than our zoning code. And we knew they were different. You could have guessed in which way they're different, but it's so amazing to see it documented and actually in numbers. Like, it's proof that we weren't crazy. But that kind of begs the question for me is like, so our goal is to have our zoning code more closely match comprehensive plan. Skip to the end, it's the same. Who wins? Who benefits from having, why is it better for the world if our comprehensive plan is more similar to the zone? Is it better for residents? Is it better for developers? Is it better for planners? Or who's it better
I
for?
think it just brings more predictability, like, for everyone. For residents, for property owners, like, we're telling people, this is the expectation, this is what you can do. There's no guessing.
There's still gonna be very.
I mean, there's still gonna be, there's still gonna be some PUDs, there's still gonna be variance requests and things like that, but like, our comp plan and our small area plans, that's a statement of like what we're saying we want. And our regulations are kind of how we get there, and right now they don't align. So we're kind of telling people, this is what we want, but then we have this set of regulations that this is what you can actually do.
Right.
And they're so wildly off that when people come and try to build what we're saying we want, it's just kind of the Wild West of guessing.
And then when people go, oh, they want to change the zoning, well, let's look at the zoning code. And they look at the zoning code, it's 40 years old, and we're like, no, there's a comprehensive plan. And they're like, what do you mean there's a comprehensive plan? Right? So there's just so much information for, one residential person or just one resident here to kind of go through, that it gets difficult. And I think because there's been 40 years, it's really kind of become extravagant lately. It feels like it to me.
Really, it's a city that's been built the last 60, 70 years based on this. We're gonna create a zoning ordinance around this project. With the PRDs, the MDD, and now it's the PUD, we just call it but it's the same way that we've planned the city for 70 years.
But I think to Addison's, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think to Addison's point about, people call up and you can't even give them an answer about, anything that they want to do. And I think at this point in time, when we have a lot of 60 and 70-year-old homes where they want to do something and change those homes, there's a huge percentage of residences that are ripe for either change or remodel or something like that. I think it's incumbent upon us to make that as easy a process or as streamlined or as transparent a process as can be by aligning, all of this so that they don't have to hire a surveyor just to find out, what their setback needs to be or something like that. So that's.
Right, and like when a business owner buys a piece of property, they want to know what they can do with it, right? And same thing with the homeowner, especially now if we allow ADUs and stuff. If you buy a house in Edina and you can do ADUs in a certain way, it's better to have all that information kind of up front. But actually, there's a much more pragmatic reason for it. And that's because zoning didn't exist until, I think, the 1920s. And before then, anything went. And so cities started implementing zoning. And then I think it was a case from Ohio, went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that, sure, you can have zoning, but you must have a plan to show that you're not just spot zoning people out or whatever. And so, and it's Minnesota state law and part of the Met Council too, that cities within the Met Council's domain have to have a comprehensive plan and it has to match, the zoning for the city. So it's a legal requirement.
That's good. I agree with all that. It was more a rhetorical question than anything else. I wanted to be sure I knew why we were doing this and what the expected outcome was supposed to be.
But it helps knowing, repeating these things and hearing.
Yeah, and I mean, different cities have different purposes for doing it. So, again, St. Louis Park in some ways is very focused on housing, in the ways that they look at housing, and that's driving how they change their code. Whereas other codes we update, it's more about making it more user-friendly, get rid of things that we don't use anymore, make it development friendly. I mean, we've worked with cities that said, make it so that when the property owners and developers came, like you were saying, make it easy to use, so it's not this cryptic thing that has to be interpreted by staff every time.
I think to your point, David, of like when they're not in alignment, the things that you can do without coming and requesting flexibility, like what you're just allowed to do under the code, people can just do development then that might not align with what we want, right? So like people can build a certain way that maybe isn't the way we would want them to. So that's why it's important to like bring them into alignment.
So that brings up another interesting point. So some U of M students had a capstone project. Were they informed of that project?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So that's the result of that?
I know we started to look at it, they recommended a smaller lot size, right? Minimum lot size. And that would sound like,
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was an overlay or, transportation, along corridors, you could have greater density, and even along the bikeway, which I thought was interesting, greater density.
Yeah, so as far as, we're not really ready to say what all the solutions are, but one solution we've been landing on more often than not is to have the zoning districts really identify or define the housing types that are allowed in them. So, a real practical way of doing that is to put the uses into a table and just say single unit, double unit, townhouses, courtyard cottages, whatever those things are, medium-sized apartments versus large size, all those things, get those defined, and then setback, or not so much setbacks, but lot area, lot width, those things can be different by housing type instead of just by a district. So most codes that we work with, that the lot sizes are determined just by the district, because traditionally they would have just been one housing type or a primary housing type. But if you mix the housing types, then you can say townhouses can have narrower lots in the same district because they are narrower. So a lot of times we see, I'm wandering a little bit, but a lot of times we see townhouses aren't identified adequately in a code. So they, in some cities, they're all the PUDs, right? You guys ran into this city in Iowa because the code just wasn't set up for them. So the minimum lot size was way too big for an individual townhouse. So they would just do PUDs. They do the setbacks differently, they do everything differently. Rather than have a district that allowed it, they would just do PUDs. So we've been going towards having districts defined that have the housing types defined, and then if the standards need to be different, they're different by housing type, so that, it works for the housing type that you want in there.
What's the advantage of housing type as opposed to just density? Why do we care what the housing type is? Whether it's a cottage thing or townhomes, does it matter?
Yeah, it's still, with the lot areas, it still calculates to a density, so we're looking at the density But a lot of zoning codes don't have the density in it. It's in the comprehensive plan.
Oh, I see.
And so, it's still there, but we've actually worked with some cities that are outside the Metropolitan Council that, you know, they're not as dense as cities in the metro area, but they don't have density so prominently in their code or their comprehensive plan. It's really more about what type of housing they want, how many units, and so they don't actually calculate the density, and we kind of leaned into that to say, I don't know, maybe you don't want to put that in there, you know, because at some point, density just becomes a calculation that doesn't really mean anything to everybody, and it looks really different. I mean, density of 15 looks very different based on the housing type. So, so that's one of the solutions we've been getting to, I guess, to your question about what do you do next. I think we're saying so far, you should have base districts. So for residential, you should at least have a low density, medium density, and high density district. We would probably suggest that there's a mix of housing types allowed in those. Maybe even the low density, but you know, every community has to have that conversation. And
Well, yeah, and then as you get into that analysis, that's when you start to look at the existing neighborhoods or the existing patterns that you see in the city and say, you know, does it make sense to have multiple different districts, or does it make sense to kind of to treat certain areas differently? And maybe it does, or maybe it doesn't. It really depends community to community and kind of based on that analysis. So that's kind of the next jump, is once you start to see the patterns that you start to look at with the audit, get kind of those basic maps in. You can use those moving forward as far as looking at, you know, where is the right cutoff for, you know, that first district versus the next one for lot size or lot width or whatever it may be. This helps to kind of start to position you to be able to answer that question.
Maybe this is obvious, or maybe it's what you were saying before, but it seems like you'd have to have a dense, like when you're comparing the comprehensive plan to the zoning, and we saw that time after time, the comprehensive plan has higher aspirations than the zoning does. So if we're gonna really get to the comprehensive plan goals, we'd have to enforce minimums in our zone. So you would have minimums and maximums in multifamily residential, minimum densities?
Generally, we would not, well, and Jeff, you've done other
it's
codes that I have.
It's not very common.
Generally, we wouldn't put density in the code itself. We would talk
right,
about
right.
lot area in the code. And so as part of a code update, we are balancing the densities in the comp plan and then making sure that the lot areas that are set are appropriate with that
When you
density.
say lot area, you mean lot coverage?
No, I
No.
mean lot area, the size of the lot
So like a 15,000 square foot minimum lot size
is a lot.
computes or calculates to about a 3 unit density. So we just calculate how many lots you could fit in an acre of land.
I'm thinking more of high density. So the numbers between the comp plan and the zone were like, it was like 50 to 100, I don't know what the numbers, 50 or 60 was the
Yeah.
low
I see what
end.
you're saying.
And our high end in the zone was below the low end of the comp plan. So it seemed, thinking out loud, it seems like we would need minimums in the zone description.
Yeah, you probably would.
But you could, wait, this probably would never work in a data, but you could also have minimum height. We always talk
Yeah.
about maximum
Yeah.
height.
Yeah, yep.
But you could have
There's-
minimum height.
There's
You
a
do
lot
in
of,
Salt Lake, I know.
a lot of districts or a lot of cities that have at least some that say, you know, it needs to be 6 to 8 stories or whatever the number is.
Yeah.
But
Sometimes there could be minimum densities. There could also be districts that are high density where you say you don't want twin homes. But, you know, certain housing types you don't want in the high density districts because you're trying to have more people there
you only
to
allow
support
those higher
businesses
density
and
uses.
walkability and all that, so you don't want to allow really low density in that district. Just to get through as much as we can tonight, so we also looked at the small area plans that are in the comprehensive plan, and I think everything's actually in the comp plan, except the guidelines are kind of in the comp plan, but they're guidelines, so they're not required. Is that how it works? Yeah, so, so there's a bunch of them. They have, we've looked at them at a high level. So what's in there is zoning related requirements. So individual plans have things about density, building heights, allowed ground floor heights, upper floor step backs. There's height and density bonuses, and at least one of them we saw. Building step backs. So these are all things that are typically in a zoning code that are in your small area plans, which seems challenging. Ideally, it'd be in the code, but I guess that's something we look at it when we start updating the districts. Because today it'd be hard to put them somewhere because you don't really have a district you would target. So yeah, so you kind of have to do it this way. It seems like.
Right, and putting that language in the code is giving it the full effect of being able to actually require that, instead of saying, this is our plan, this is what we'd like to see, but we don't have that legal. Not always, sometimes you do have.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but like with the self-build design experience guidelines, often projects don't meet all of it.
You just can't.
So then it's a
Right.
discussion
wouldn't
about
wanna
which pieces
codify
make
all
sense
of
to
it.
codify and which pieces should stay as guidelines.
The other thing we looked at, which we touched on, but the R1 district, which is such a big district, has this 9,000 square feet, this median, we talked about that. It applies to the width and the depth of the lot as well. There's significant non-conforming lots, and that can't really be mapped fully, but we have the map showing the 9,000 square foot area as the breaking point. And just those standards are overly complicated. If there's some way to make those easier to use would be a good thing to update. So that's the map. Actually, staff did this map. We didn't do this map, right? Yep. So we have that mapping that can help out with the update. And then we've mapped the existing lot sizes by kind of band of size. So what size are they if they're under 9,000 or over 9,000? So you can see in here anything that's, there's similarities to the other map, but anything that's blue, you can see some get down. There's a few that are below 5,000, but there's a lot between 5 and 7, and then 7 and 9 in those areas that are under 9. So that would help you decide, well, the minimum lot size, should it be 7,000? Should it be 6,000? How much of these non-conforming lots do you want to address with a new zoning district? So, any questions or comments about that information?
Can you go back one slide? So, conforming greater than 9,000 square feet and non-conforming less than 9,000 square feet?
Well, yeah, I guess, and I think I changed the wording on that in the one that's in your packet, because it's a little misleading to say that they're conforming. It just means they're over 9,000.
Okay.
Doesn't mean that they meet that median standard, so they could still be non-conforming.
Yeah.
Okay, so all the yellow is just over 9,000 and all the
Yes.
aqua is non-conforming less than 9,000?
Yes, all of the blue is definitely
Okay.
non-conforming, and at least half of the ones, probably about half of the ones that are yellow would also be non-conforming.
Okay.
If you did that median calculation.
For lot area, yeah.
Okay, yes. Okay.
And I think another thing to keep in mind is that as some property owners, maybe acquire the property next to them and combine their lots,
Yeah.
now the median in the neighborhood just got bigger. And as that happens over time, you can see how that would be problematic.
And that's just lot area.
Right.
Probably half of those don't meet the
Yeah,
width
don't meet the
requirement.
width or something.
Right, so if they're non-conforming with respect to any of those three, area, width, or depth, it's not conforming.
Do you know when 9,000 came in? And that was,
70s or 80s.
so it was after the fact for a lot of the east side lots, yeah. And we've seen that in other cities where, yeah, everything before that's not conforming all of a sudden.
But we have, I mean, it doesn't happen often, but we have approved subdivisions under 9,000, haven't we? With various-
Yes, yeah, so Lou could probably attest as the longtime planning commissioner. In my time, I've created a map where subdivisions we've approved that were under the 9,000 and those we've denied. And it's a mixture, it's half-half. Some neighborhoods get approved, some don't. A lot of it is based, if you're the last, if the whole block is 50-foot wide lots, but you're the last 100-footer, those have been approved. But there have been a lot of instances where there's 2 or 3 100-foot wide lots, and those have been denied. Some of those have been approved. We even had one site that was originally denied, and the same property owner came back like 2-3 years ago and got it approved. So yeah, it's just a case-by-case basis. Does it fit in the neighborhood? Does it not?
Well,
It's kinda-
depending who's on the commission and who's on the council,
Yep.
probably more than anything.
It changes.
And is the number 9,000 part of that conversation, or it's just, they're smaller than the
It's
current
usually
lots, or
they're
just-
smaller than the 9,000
So they're keyed in on the 9,000.
and the 50-foot. It's a 100-foot wide lot going to 50. That's the,
But even lots where like, it was originally 2 lots and they combined them, and now they want to divide them again, we occasionally deny that.
yeah, just reestablishing the
Yeah,
old plat.
yeah,
Yep.
which makes no sense. So is there is there like a, if you go down to minimum lots, if you graph lot sizes, well, I guess minimum would be this way. Is there a point where it kind of just falls off, where there's some, a few that are really, really small, but generally there's like a general minimum, like for those eastern lots, like east of France?
I'm thinking they're usually around 6,700 square feet, 50-foot wide lot, 130-foot depth. It's usually right around there.
So those would be the dark blue
Yeah.
on this map.
So would it make sense to make that the minimum lot size for the east side of Medina or whatever? Because the worst that can happen is that a developer would have to buy like 3 lots to make 4 houses or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's a tiny increase in
Like the
density.
Hankerson neighborhood, those are platted 50-foot wide lots, but those 2 that we looked at, they're 75-footers. But the underlying plat is 3 lots for those 2 sites.
Yeah, in these areas, I mean, the depth of those half blocks is gonna be, what it is. So it's really more about the width, like what's the width that people are comfortable with in those neighborhoods.
And I will say that depth is not something that we often see in the code, just because if you're already regulating area and width, your depth is also regulated, and so what you're doing is you're causing yet another chance for something to be non-conforming. You're just adding that one extra calculation that might tip something over in need of variance or something, if you've already got 2, you don't need the 3rd.
Okay.
Right, like along 4th Street, where, because the light rail, the streetcar used to go through, so you've got lots that are like the minimum size, but they're wider than they are deep.
Yeah.
And it's like, is there really a difference? It's the same lot size.
All right, we can come back to anything. We want to get through these development procedures and get your input on this as well.
Yeah, so I think let's just go to that. So we, with help from staff, put the current development review procedures that you have, and we didn't do all of them, but we did certain ones that we wanted to focus on. And we put them in a table for you just to see kind of what is the process for each of these types of requests or applications that you get. And so the first few columns there are just kind of preliminary meetings that might be required or encouraged. But really what you want to look at is those furthest to the right, those 3 columns there. And that's telling us, is there administrative review that's involved? Is there planning commission involvement? Is there council involvement? And so the R that you see there that's the body or the individual that's just reviewing. The D that's the body or individual that's making the decision. And then the public hearing is that PH. So where is there a public hearing required? And so
R stands for?
review, it's right on the bottom.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. So that's
Okay,
just who's reviewing it. So most of the time, that's gonna be the planning commission. You're holding the public hearing, you're reviewing that, you're providing a recommendation, and then that's going to council for final decision. What the couple of takeaways here that we've really seen is, if you look at the number of public hearings that are required for these types of applications, that is significantly more than we see in most cities. It's more than what's required by the state. And so what you're doing, for better or worse, is you are providing more opportunities for public involvement. Often that lengthens the process, either for length of meeting or just for the fact that you have to notify all of these. You have to kind of have your timelines be a little bit longer to make sure that people are informed that this is occurring and that they have time to be able to attend or not. The other piece that it's not on this table but is relevant to mention is that council, when they hold a public hearing, they don't act. They table it, and you have another council meeting that's required. Yeah.
I'm not sure, are you aware that last year the planning commission went to the city council in order to try to affect change around?
Yeah, yes, we are, yes.
Not met warmly?
I know. I know you guys have, you've heard this over and over.
I just want to make sure that you were aware of that whole process.
Nope, we are with you. Let's see, is there anything else? Oh, I think the other piece here is that you see that there's one administrative review on here. So most of the decisions for these types of applications are lying in council's hands. So if we go to the next, maybe the site plan. So I just want to talk about a few of these. And again, you've probably heard some of this before, but site plan as a standalone request is pretty infrequent. Often you'll be reviewing a site plan in conjunction with a variance or a CUP or a preliminary plat or whatever it might be. So site plans on their own don't happen overly frequently. And typically that would be that this is a project that's coming in, they're gonna build a commercial building that meets code. But you need to make sure that they have planted enough trees and they're meeting the setbacks and whatever it might be. So generally speaking, we don't see most cities have public hearings for this. State statute doesn't require those types of public hearings. And the reason for that is because this type of site plan is pretty black and white. If it meets code, you have to approve it. If it doesn't, you don't. And so there's kind of that weighing of, is public involvement something that's necessary or helpful when there's not leeway for the city to make a decision or to add a condition or something like that? Because if they meet code, they meet code, and you have to allow it anyway. So are the public hearings something that's helpful or important when it comes to something that is pretty black and white? The other piece, as I was reviewing site plan, that we wanted to touch on is the opportunities for allowing some administrative review of these. Again, because this is often such a black and white topic, obviously if there's a variance or if something doesn't meet code, this would come back to you. But for those projects that meet all the code requirements, but still need to be reviewed and make sure that they are meeting those code requirements, is there a little bit more appetite for flexibility to allow staff to do that review rather than going through both city council and planning commission to look at those? And so what we typically see, and Edina does allow a little bit of this, is for minor modifications, where maybe you're only enlarging the building. For Edina, it's if you're enlarging the building by less than 10%, that's something that staff can review and check off the list. Other cities I've worked with increase that number to about 25%. And so there's a little bit more room for people to do additions or other types of projects and go through an administrative review. So there are additional opportunities to allow for administrative review of site plans if that's something that the city is open to exploring or interested in. So
We rarely have site plans unless they're
rarely standalone.
standalone.
So like the hockey training facility was a recent one, and I think it had maybe been a while since we had one of those, and so when we brought it forward, you know, we look at our pyramid of discretion, it was like, well, we have very little discretion because it meets code, so it's really just a review. And there was some feedback of like, well, wait, why are we doing this? Why do we have to take action? It meets code, we can't really do anything. Why are we inviting the public here to seek their input when we can't really do anything with their input? It's confusing to people, and it kind of sends the wrong message.
Okay.
So why was
What's that?
Our code requires public hearings.
Yeah, it's written into the code that we have multiple public hearings for a project that is 100% code compliant.
So it's that top line on the table. So you're right now, the code is requiring a public hearing with planning commission and a public hearing with council. So it's 3 meetings for a site.
That meets code.
And
That we can't do
do
anything
get very, very
We do,
few
very
of those, but on occasion, every 3-4 years, we'll get one.
But that's because that site was a commercial or PUD before, because of someone just does a site plan.
It's the area of that site that was planned for a third sheet of ice, so they had room out there.
Yeah.
They just never built the third phase.
But like the dental clinic, that needed variances, but they could have been done in a way that met code. So that could have been another example where had they designed it that way, we would have still had to go through the public hearing process and review, but we would have had very little opportunity to make them change anything, and we would be asking the public to come out and give their input when we can't really do anything with it.
And in theory, if you have base districts that are working and
Right.
you've
do
got
them all the time, right?
properties that are zoned correctly,
Yeah.
you'd get to the point where site plan is what you're doing.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to constantly rezone or
Right.
ask for variances.
And
or
that
things.
gets back to that predictability, right? Everybody knows what the expectation is. There's no guessing.
Does that make sense? So the reason you're not seeing site plans is because you're rezoning and doing
You're
PUD.
doing more
Right.
involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a good
Okay.
process to have in place, but you're just
Okay.
not using it because of the way the code works today.
Okay.
And another case for the base zoning.
Right.
Another.
So how do we require things like affordable housing or whatever? How do we do that sort of thing?
Yeah,
It's written into our base
It's
district
written into
for
the
PCD.
PCD as a conditional use. Our attorney was good with that as a conditional use. But that's where it's stopped, so that's part of the PUD.
And I think we've heard that, obviously that's an important part of the PUD today. And we're kind of at the point in the audit that we know that that's something that's important to the city, and we haven't fully taken the step to understand exactly what routes we could take. We've talked a little bit about different incentives and saying, you know, if somebody wants to do affordable housing, maybe there's ways to lower some of the requirements or something like that to kind of balance, but it hasn't gone any further than actually talking about what that would look like at this
But
point.
that's part of your scope, is to make a recommendation on that?
Well,
It'd be part of the next
it's
phase.
the
where-
next, the code writing scope.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is
Because,
just audit.
yeah, because, I mean, you could do it, you don't have an inclusionary housing policy, right?
We have a policy, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds.
But it's on the code.
Well, it's in the PCD.
It's
What
in the-
we have
That's
in
what
the
it is.
PCD
Yeah,
matches the
okay,
policy.
okay, so that's how that's working,
Yeah.
yeah,
So we would need to write it into the other districts.
yeah.
Like if we created a high-density residential district that we intended to use, we could write it in there.
Yeah.
Right now, we don't have any place to put it. because we don't
It
have
all
zones.
circles back to that,
Right.
doesn't it?
Interesting.
more thoughts on site plan before we scoop? Just a couple more to touch on here. So rezoning to PUD, this is something that, as we were talking with staff, found that it kind of had a circular problem. So again, going back to the fact that there aren't base districts that are up to modern market standards or desires of the city, what you're getting is you're getting more requests for simple PUDs. Maybe it's one building or maybe it's 2 lots. Things that in theory shouldn't be PUDs.
Yeah.
And then because of that, those types of PUDs are having trouble meeting the standards or the purpose and intent of the PUD, which is bringing up issues as you review them and saying, well, this PUD, I'm fine with the project, but it doesn't meet the purpose or intent of a PUD. It's like, yes, because it really shouldn't be, but this is your only route to do it right now. And so it's kind of a circular issue that you're having with particularly those simpler types of PUDs. This is one of those review processes that is longer. So if you include the recommended sketch plan process, a PUD project is looking at 6 meetings, 2 public hearings, which is extensive, which may or may not be a good thing. I mean, if it is a particularly complicated project, you want that extra review to look at it and make sure that it makes sense. If it's a simple PUD, does it really make sense to have 6 meetings? I don't know. The other piece here is, again, talking about, are there opportunities to review modifications administratively? Again, trying to cut down on the number of times that you have to go through this fairly extensive review process. And so right now, 1 minor modification is allowed to be approved administratively for each PUD. Sounds like that's been working for staff since that's been written into the code, where you get 1 minor modification. If it's larger or if you need multiple changes, then you're going back through that normal review process. I would say most commonly we see kind of a list of minor modifications and say any of these are okay for staff to approve instead of just limiting them to 1. But sounds like you've been fine with just the 1.
Yeah,
So
we have a list, but you can only do it 1 time.
Right. And normally I just see the list and don't see just the 1. But if it's been working, I don't know that we need to really harp on it. So. You guys both look like you're thinking. Or have thoughts to say.
No, I am thinking, but nothing to spout yet.
Okay, that's fair. I think the last one I wanted to touch on here was talking about subdivisions and particularly lot splits. And so lot splits are those pretty minor subdivisions. You've got 1 lot, maybe you're splitting it into 2, maybe 3. And right now that's something that's required to go through your full platting procedure. So again, multiple public hearings, multiple meetings for something that, in theory, if you're meeting code, it really shouldn't need to be that complicated. This is something that, as we were talking with staff, and it's been brought up tonight, that especially for those lots that were previously combined and now they want to split back to how they were originally, going through this really long process is kind of extensive for that. A lot of the cities that we look at use what we call a minor subdivision process for this. And it allows a shortened review process. Usually what I've seen is it's just a council review without a public hearing, but that changes from city to city, and it caps it. So it says, if you're gonna do a subdivision that creates 3 lots or 2 lots or whatever the city's comfortable with, then you can go through a shortened review process. You don't need to go through this full preliminary and final platting phase.
Do we see a lot of that? Because I've been on the commission, and I have not seen that since I've been on the commission.
We haven't had many lately, but even a code compliant plat can be some of the most difficult projects that you'll face. Think of the ones in Rolling Green where we had code compliant. Remember the 3-lot one up there? Yeah, they can be, even if they're code compliant. And then when there's variances attached to them, then it's even more difficult.
We generally have like 1 a year, I think, on average.
Yeah.
When they're code compliant, you're saying they're difficult
Yeah.
from like a political standpoint or like?
Political standpoint, yeah. Yeah. did deny one, this was probably 25 years ago, a code compliant one, and we got sued and lost, and we had established some tree protection on it, and when you lose a lawsuit like that, you lose all those conditions that and they cut all the trees down, and, but we've approved subdivisions that were code compliant, but they can be difficult.
So I'm ignorant on this issue, so platting, what would be a situation where you need to do platting versus not for subdivision? So I'm just not familiar with platting as a process.
When it's not, it's not even a subdivision, it's
So
a
there's-
shift of a lot line.
Yeah, so if there's two lots and you're just shifting where that lot or where the line between them is, you don't require a plat for that. The other piece that you don't require a plat for is if you have one lot where there's a townhome with 4 units, and you're gonna divide that into, now it's gonna be 4 lots. That doesn't require platting, I believe.
In the code today.
Things with, what is it, a party wall, or there's a
We see
specific
some of
term.
those with duplexes, where it's existing duplex and they wanna sell each side, then they have to have a firewall in between, and we do those administratively. It's,
Those are the only two that don't require
So the
platting.
lot adjustment just requires a survey, and then
Yeah,
that just
plat
gets
line
recorded.
adjustment is, yep, and then it's administratively.
Yeah,
reviewed.
that was a code change we made probably 10 years ago. We were bringing those through public hearings, and the council said, yeah, we don't need that, you can approve those staff.
Yeah,
So
and
that's
that's,
worked pretty well.
and that's common practice.
Yeah,
is
we get
that's
3-4 of
administrative.
those every year.
Again, obviously, if something's not code compliant, then you're gonna be bringing that through, but if everything meets it, then there's really no need for everybody to see it and have the neighborhood come.
Is it a state requirement that planning commission review every single variance of every kind?
It's state law that a zoning board of appeals, and you are the zoning board of appeals.
You don't technically need a public hearing for that.
Right.
You do.
Well,
For-
our code does, but
Code
state
does,
law
but
does
state
not
law
require.
does not require a public hearing for variances.
But that's not on your list of,
That wasn't one we were doing a deep dive on.
okay.
But I would say it's pretty typical.
Most cities
cities to hold public
require the
hearings.
public hearing, but in theory, you don't have to. Or sometimes they take off the required public notice, and they say, you gotta notice the neighborhood, but maybe they don't have like the 350 feet or something, like they'll mess with the notification a little bit. But usually they still inform the neighborhood.
Do you require 2 for variance, 2 public hearings? Just the one?
Planning commission takes final action.
But like, we don't publish it in the paper, but we do send notices to neighbors within 200, things like that.
When it's appealed to council, is that a public?
It's the same, we follow the same process.
So we renotice
Yes.
in that case.
Yep.
And you put it on Better Together.
Oh, yeah.
Overarching thoughts about procedures I think that's kind of where we're wrapping up tonight, so. Other than what you guys have already.
Or anything we've talked
Or
about.
anything that we've talked
Yeah.
about.
What about FAR?
What about it?
I have to think about it every time it comes up, because it's like, it stretches my brain as to why we care or whatever, but is it something a lot of cities do?
I feel like typically.
FAR, floor area ratio.
A lot of times you can logic your way to get rid of it, that it's not needed. So if you're doing density, you're doing building heights, you're doing lot coverage, impervious surface, there's a lot of things you're doing to get what you want. FAR is challenging.
I would say most of the codes, and I don't know if this is just because we're planners and we don't love doing lots of math, but I would say most of the codes we look at, we would rely more on impervious surface or height, and we would get rid of the FAR piece of things.
Yeah, and I mean, my understanding, don't quote me, but FAR is really developed for much higher density areas, New York City,
For downtowns, yeah.
or downtowns, yeah.
Massive buildings, yeah.
Because it gives you flexibility to do things where most cities we're working with, you don't need that kind of flexibility for development. Because you're controlling so many other things. I mean, with lot coverage, I mean, downtown New York, you're not gonna have lot coverage. I mean, it's 100%.
We already have, yeah, setbacks, lot coverage requirements, height requirements, that there's indirectly a floor area ratio maximum that gets imposed, so.
And then you do, when you do start to dive into all those requirements, one of the things that we often look at is kind of like the lot area width and depth. Are there regulations that are kind of layering on top of one another to kind of conflict at times? And do we need all of these regulations, or which ones are the ones that are important for the city to be able to make sure that there's green space or sunlight or whatever it happens to be, but
Which happens with FAR a lot, right?
Well, I
You
think we
create
have
conflicts.
FAR in our districts that are
FAR.
used across different parts of the city, so like PCD 3, or, well, I guess that's just Southdale, but like some of those FARs don't allow the type of like development density that's called for in the comp plan, they're like more restrictive than.
They're too low, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, are there ways of requiring, like it happened at Nolan Main's, where they have that nice little community, kind of public area where, it's a good-sized building or buildings or whatever. And so I guess maybe that's related to FAR, or the reason why you might have FAR, but where you have a break, so it's not just like this massive building. Because if that were just a massive building, it wouldn't be nearly as engaging as it is with that little area. But I think that was a city council member who really pushed for that. There wasn't really, it's nothing in our code that requires anything like that, right?
Well, it's small area plan, we talked about transitions to neighborhoods too. So as part of that scaling down on the. This is in the middle of the, in between the buildings.
Yeah,
the
That was a
courtyard.
PUD.
Oh,
though.
inside.
Yeah, so that's where it came from, the
Okay.
PUD.
Right, but there's no regulations on that or anything. It's all hand carved.
Yeah, I mean, you could have building or architectural standards that get at that, or they could be in the guidelines where you show the developer, this is what we want, and you get close to what you want and give them flexibility.
Or I've
You can do it
seen
either way.
requirements for, it can be open space, it can be public space, it can be kind of whatever you're looking for. And that can be based on the number of units in a development or just the square footage of, for every, 1,000 square feet of retail space, we need X number of public space available or something. And then it's up to that developer to decide where to put it, but at least in some form or fashion, you're getting. So, seen that happen too. Well, I think we can wrap up with the next steps here. So we are kind of through our review or analysis of the code, and we need to prepare the draft audit report, which is going to be based on a lot of what we've been talking about with all of you and with staff. And so once that's ready, then we'll be doing a joint meeting with Planning Commission and Council, and then kind of finishing it up once we get all of your final feedback. So that's where we're headed.
Is there anything that we haven't hit on that you struggle with the code when you're reviewing things? Or sections of the code that you just think we haven't talked about? Just curious.
Well, did we ever resolve the retail in a industrial area, like the chocolate factory thing? Was it ever resolved?
The code allows for the 10%.
No, we haven't.
We haven't.
It's still
we
the same. We haven't changed the code.
Okay.
It's still the
That
same.
one, like if you're a large building, you can do it, but if you're a small industrial building, you can't.
It was intended to allow like retail uses inside of office buildings
Yeah.
that only serve that office building.
Yeah.
It's kind of, I guess, the way it seems like it was set up.
And I'm wondering because as our industrial areas are kind of changing or being redeveloped, or, that building was neglected and probably should have been torn down. So I was like, whatever kind of energized that building, that they were willing to kind of,
Yeah, they really fixed
you
it
know,
up.
the kids next door could have crawled underneath that building.
Right. Well, and I think that restriction on retail, like, most retailers aren't gonna go into a building if they can't have outdoor signage and they can't, you know, face the outside, right?
Yeah.
But then we've also heard from like the company that owns all those office buildings in Cahill that like, they want more retail, like that actually makes their office more attractive to tenants.
Yeah.
And so we have this restriction that actually like makes our office park less attractive to office tenants.
And so some flexibility in that industrial or that zoning, I think.
Yeah, that could be part of the next steps where we're.
Is it PID or
PID?
PID.
Right, because Cahill, we shelved the Cahill plan because nobody could decide anything, but we want things to happen there. You know, we have other industrial areas where we want stuff to happen too. So I'm thinking some flexibility in the code might be.
Right, so part of our climate action plan, you know, is to mix these uses so that you don't have to drive everywhere. You know, and you can share parking, so if you're an apartment building and there's commercial next door or whatever, then the people who live in the apartments use that parking at night, but they're gone during the day, and the people who, you know, I mean, you know, just, I don't know, modernize things, just so it's more mixed use and more shared things. Not separate things so much like you did in the 60s and 70s.
What about, Lou mentioned affordable housing and how that's, you know, a prominent part of our comprehensive plan, but doesn't show up in zoning necessarily. What about transit? I mean, are there ways our zoning code should we have a transit overlay? Or do some cities have a transit overlay saying, okay, there's some, this is an R1 or R2 or whatever it is, but the requirements are a little bit different along France Avenue? Because that ends up having to be a zoning thing unless it's going to be, it has to be in the code somehow. If we're trying to get off of one-off things.
But Dinah created that transit buffer map.
Yeah, we created a map that just visually shows kind of where existing transit routes are and kind of the properties within like a quarter mile, half mile.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a map that shows that.
That could be the basis of an overlay.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think affordable
Okay.
housing could too.
Yeah, that's a different.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of what like the student study
Yeah.
gets at.
But also like form-based zoning, is that something, I hear conflicting views on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, yes, some cities are doing, I'd say most cities that we've seen, I think technically in Minnesota, there's not a form-based code. Based on the Form-Based Code Institute or something, but a lot of codes are hybrid, so, you know, the districts become more form-based. So they have form-based standards, and the uses are more flexible, which is the opposite of the, if you were trying to think of Euclid, Ohio.
Yeah.
The Euclidean zoning was all about separating uses. The hybrid districts would be more, how do we mix uses but keep the form the same? So, I mean, a lot of cities we have more housing types allowed in a district, but you don't change the building height. You know, it's 30 or it's 35, but you're allowing some other housing types. You don't change the standards, you just, you tailor the standards to those new housing types so that you're not increasing or making it more intense, I guess.
Yeah, I think more where we've dabbled and where we've kind of seen it done is that there may be certain districts in the city that are appropriate to be form-based. So usually what we've seen is, you know, if it's the downtowns or the central business districts, or maybe it's the transit area, those specific districts might be form-based or might have more of those qualities than maybe your R1 or something like that. So some cities are kind of doing a hybrid, like you said, or a mix of certain districts are more form, other districts are.
Yeah, because our
more
small
traditional.
area plans and even like the Grandview
Right.
not a plan, it's a framework, thank you. It has all these pretty pictures about what it could look like and everything.
Yeah.
And then, a developer comes in with a two-story apartment or two-story restaurant with surface parking and it gets approved, and it's like, that's not what we were aiming for in this district at all, so.
Yeah, so sometimes we've taken plans like the Grandview framework, say, and figure out what the district could be for that area, and figure out the things that could be objective and could be standards in the district, and then other things that you want, but it's pretty hard to get at it, like whether it's, color or, just things that you feel like you can't get too restrictive, and you can have guidelines still, whether they're in the plan or a separate document, so that when somebody comes in, you show it to them, say, this is what we'd like, this is what we want. We can't require it because it's too subjective. So then you get the best of both worlds in some ways, because you're showing what you want, you're requiring the things that you need. That might be minimum 2 stories.
Some developers don't seem to care about guidelines at all, but.
What's that?
Some developers don't seem to care about guidelines at all, but.
Yeah. I mean,
Guidelines.
Well, that's the problem, is that because they're not in code,
Right.
they're
They don't
guidelines, and
have-
then it doesn't happen what you want to happen. I mean, we get all these pretty pictures, and we don't see it, right? So it's sort of frustrating when we have to vote on these things.
yeah. I mean, the good thing about guidelines is if you have pretty pictures, they might not be feasible financially, or, because you're not the developer. If the city's not the developer, and if they have some flexibility to come in and say, I get what you want, here's what we could do, and it actually would.
Yeah, well, generally, the
pencil
pretty
out.
pictures are denser than what is there.
Yeah.
And then is there possibility of like sharing zones? I mean, because, 44th in France and 70th and Cahill and probably Valley View and
Could that be one district?
Wooddale. Yeah, I mean, they're pretty similar. They're similar size and
Yeah.
everything. Do we need like everything to be custom for everything?
No.
In theory, you wouldn't have everything be custom.
Yeah, I mean, in what, the way the comprehensive plans and land uses are, I mean, there's a neighborhood node, I mean, typically a neighborhood node district could be used other places, not just in one place. The language of the comp plan could really help with the districts. All right, we're pretty close to our time, I think, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, it was
Good
fascinating.
discussion.
The joint city council planning commission meeting, that's gonna be the challenge. All their work sessions are full for the rest of the year. So I've been talking with the city manager, we may have to schedule a special night, because this is that important.
You give us a little notice for that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Couple hours.
Thank you very much, it was really great.
Yeah.